Hello and welcome to the third unit for Biology 202 and Unit 3. We're going to continue our study of the cardiovascular system. Chapter 19, we're going to focus on blood vessels and blood pressure. And so as part of this unit, you're going to learn some of the major blood vessels of the body over on the anatomy side, and you're also going to learn how the major blood vessels are connected to each other through some activities called tracing a blood drop. That will be in the anatomy area for this particular unit. Now, after we cover Chapter 19, we're going to move into the next couple of chapters, which are on the lymphatic system and the immune system. And we're not going to get into quite as much detail on those two body systems as your textbook has, especially the immune system, because most of you guys are going to take microbiology and you'll get more extensive coverage of the immune system when you take that particular course. So check Blackboard for information about how I will divide up the two tests for this unit. I don't want to say anything here on video in case I decide to change it in future semesters, but just read carefully. I'm trying to divide all these units of the two tests per unit up so that you have approximately equal amounts of material on the two, so it may not always be quite as cut and dry as you're going to have an anatomy test and you're going to have a physiology test for each unit. All right, so for our first little lecture clip here, we're going to, let's see, hang on, my little iPad I draw on here to annotate the slides is not cooperating with me. All right, there we go. It came up. All right, so as you guys already know, the blood vessels, which we've already talked about over on the Unit 2 side, this is a delivery system for blood. Blood, of course, contains all kinds of vital stuff for the body. Including good old oxygen, gas, and nutrients. Blood carries away waste, as we've already learned about. And so the blood vessels are essentially a system of highways for the blood and all of the good things that it has in it. And it's considered to begin and end at the heart. So go back and review, if you need to, the pulmonary circulation versus the systemic circulation. I'm not going to go back in and rehash that since we've already covered that back in Biology 202. In Biology 202, in Unit 2. All right, so, and now as you guys already know, some definitions to keep in mind. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. And typically your arteries contain oxygenated blood. But, you know, as we discussed back in Unit 2, that's not true for the pulmonary circulation, because the pulmonary arteries are going to carry the deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that it can become oxygenated. So you can't always go by the red and blue colors on the diagrams. All right, then arteries, as we talked about in the last unit, arteries eventually lead to arterioles. Those are very small arteries. Those then deliver blood into capillaries. And capillaries are microscopic blood vessels, and you know, they essentially contact almost every tissue cell in the body, or they come very close to those tissue cells. It depends on the type of tissue, though. There are some differences. If you think back to Biology 201 and when you learned about tissues, some tissues have good blood supplies and some do not. So the fluid inside the blood exchanges its contents with the interstitial fluids, or the tissue fluids that surround the cells of the body. And you know, many or most of our cells are not very far away from a capillary, since those capillaries are vital for supplying the things that they need. All right, and then let me erase all that. You have blood flowing through capillaries, and your capillaries lead to venules. Those are the smallest veins, and then venules converge together, you know, almost like little side streets leading to a bigger street, and those are your veins. And of course, you have smaller veins that lead to larger veins. And as you saw with the heart, the veins are bringing blood back to the heart. So with the systemic circulation, all of the veins in your body eventually dump their blood either into the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava, or in the case of the heart wall itself, that coronary sinus. Those are the only 3 blood vessels that actually dump the deoxygenated blood back into your right atrium and bring it back to the heart. All right, now how about a little bit about the structure of blood vessels themselves? So here on the left and the right, you're seeing an example artery and an example vein. And these are going to be examples of larger versions of the two rather than the smaller microscopic arterioles and venules. And then down here you are seeing an example of a capillary. And again, those are very, very narrow microscopic type blood vessels. Okay, so arteries and veins have 3 major layers, and those are called tunics. If you think of a tunic being like a coat, there are 3 layers or 3 coats that form the walls of our arteries and veins. Now, there are some differences between the two in terms of what the composition is of those 3 layers in arteries versus veins, but they have all 3. The innermost layer is called the tunica intima, and that's where you have your endothelium. So right there and right over here on the vein, that's the innermost layer. That's epithelial tissue. It's simple squamous epithelial tissue, which means the cells are flat. They're only 1 layer in thickness, and it's supposed to form a nice smooth surface on the interior of the blood vessels. So that's called our endothelium. That is continuous with the endothelium of the heart, which we call the endocardium in that case. That forms that inner lining of the heart. All right, the middle layer is called the tunica media, media for middle, and this is largely composed of smooth muscle. So that's this layer over here in the artery and this layer over here in the vein, if you look carefully at those diagrams. And hopefully you're noticing there that the tunica media, the smooth muscle layer, is thicker in arteries than it is in veins, and that winds up being very important for their function. You tend to have more contraction of arteries is necessary than what you have with veins. That's very important for helping us maintain our blood pressure. Another thing you may notice if you look at these diagrams really carefully, arteries have an internal elastic membrane and an external. Hang on, I'm having some technical issues here again. I'm waiting for my iPad to communicate with my computer screen here so I can draw on it again. All right, sorry about that. A little temporary glitch. As I was pointing out, on the artery side, the tunica intima has a layer of elastic tissue, or a layer that contains this connective tissue that has a lot of elastic fibers in it. That's called the internal elastic membrane. And then the tunica media also has a layer. They're drawing it in, looks like yellow Swiss cheese or something there on the diagram. That's the external elastic membrane. That's a little thin layer. You've got some connective tissues on either side of the smooth muscle that has a lot of elastic fibers in it. And that's also very important for the function of your arteries as well. If you think about it, the arteries are receiving the blood that's being pumped out of the heart, so they need to be able to expand because they're getting that big push of blood with each heartbeat. And so they're going to expand in size, and they need some elastic tissue in there so that as that blood moves forward, they can rebound and maintain their original shape. That's very important for helping to maintain the blood pressure within your blood vessels that's going to allow the blood to circulate. If your arteries got pushed out and they never were able to rebound and go back to their usual size, you wouldn't get as strong of a push of the blood throughout the body. All right, and then finally, the third or the more external layer is called the tunica externa in both our arteries and our veins, and that is a connective tissue layer. It's going to blend in with the surrounding connective tissues where these arteries and veins are located. Lots of collagen fibers within the tunica externa. If you guys remember when you studied connective tissues back in Biology 201, collagen fibers provide tensile strength, so they help resist pulling. So as the walls of your arteries and veins get stretched due to blood flowing through them, the collagen fibers in there help prevent the walls from being ripped open, which would not be a good thing if that happens. Another thing I want to highlight to you here on this diagram, the vasa vasorum. If you look really carefully at the tunica externa on your arteries and your veins, if you notice on there, there are some red arteries and some blue veins that are very small that are being shown in cross-section, most of them. So what the vasa vasorum is, that's the system of arteries and veins that actually supplies the walls of your larger arteries and veins. So that can be kind of hard to think about at first, but your larger arteries and veins are so big that they actually need their own little teeny tiny arteries and veins within the walls to provide a blood supply to the tissues of the wall itself. And that system of blood vessels is called the vasa vasorum. Okay, some other terminology here. I think I covered most of this, but one thing I did not point out on that last slide is that the central blood-containing space within your arteries and veins and all of your blood vessels is called the lumen. And of course, lumen is a pretty common term that's used to refer to spaces within bodies. You can also have spaces within cells that are called lumens as well. All right, this is a picture I put in from your textbook. This is actually figure 19.1 in your textbook, and it is showing you an artery and a vein that have been sliced open in a cross section. So you're looking at them head on like that. And this has been done to illustrate the differences for you. So right in here, what I'm coloring in green, that's the lumen of that artery. And over here, here's the lumen of the vein that's running in parallel. Your major arteries and veins tend to run in parallel with each other. So the arteries are bringing blood, oxygenated blood to particular tissues, and then the veins are carrying the deoxygenated blood back toward the heart. And so they tend to run right next to each other when they serve particular locations of the body. But if you look carefully at your artery diagram here, where you're seeing all of those stretched out purple marks and the lighter pink colored tissue, that is the smooth muscle tunica media of the artery. And over here, if you look at the vein, you don't really see a very thick, smooth muscle wall in there. It's much, much thinner. And that's just illustrating that that's really the biggest difference between arteries and veins. Arteries tend to be a lot more muscular. Okay, this slide is just outlining for you some major features of these three tunics, the tunica intima, media, and externa. There is another name for the tunica externa. Some sources will refer to it as the tunica adventitia, so just be aware of that. And again, your tunica intima, the main feature there is the endothelium. That's that inner simple squamous epithelial tissue lining. It is supposed to be a slick surface. It's supposed to be smooth. And if you guys remember when we were back studying the blood and we talked about thrombi that can form within our blood vessels, where you have internal blood clots within the lumen of blood vessels, we don't want that to happen, and the slick surface helps prevent that. When you no longer have a slick surface, that can set off the chain of reactions that leads to the formation of a thrombus. The tunica media, mainly composed of smooth muscle. The arteries have sheets of elastin to help them rebound their shape. But another major important feature, which we'll be talking about more later, there are actually sympathetic nerve fibers that extend into the tunica media, and they contact and control contraction of those smooth muscles in there. So they help determine whether those blood vessels are going to be constricted if the smooth muscle tissue in there is contracting, or dilated when it's not contracting. So that's those terms vasoconstriction and vasodilation that you've heard before. Very important for blood flow and blood pressure. If you constrict the walls of blood vessels, that's going to increase the blood pressure in there, just like if you were squeezing the walls of a garden hose. It's going to increase the water pressure in the garden hose. And then again, the tunica externa, connective tissue, lots of collagen fibers in there that helps prevent the walls from ripping open as easily. Helps the walls resist pulling forces. And also those collagen fibers in there, the tunica externa, winds up anchoring those blood vessels to neighboring tissues. So they kind of blend in with surrounding connective tissues. That helps keep your blood vessels in place. You don't want your blood vessels flopping all over the place inside your body. You can have nerve fibers, microscopic nerve fibers that extend into the tunica externa as well. Plus they're on their way to the tunica media, that middle layer where they're going to control your smooth muscle tissues. You also have lymphatic vessels within that outer layer as well. The lymphatic system we're going to cover in the next chapter, and but it plays an important role in helping to control your tissue fluid levels, and so you have lymphatic vessels throughout most tissues in your body also. And again, as I just mentioned, you do have the vasa vasorum. Those are the tiny arteries and veins. You also have arteries to arterioles, to capillaries, to venules, to little tiny veins, just like in all of the tissues or most of the tissues in your body that help provide a blood supply to the cells that actually exist within the walls of your larger blood vessels. Okay, and this is just a diagram from your textbook again, which is showing you the relationship of these blood vessels to each other and also to this lymphatic system that I'm talking about. So here's the heart. Always think about blood flow beginning and ending at the heart. And on the next video clip, we're going to talk about how your arteries and veins can be divided up into different categories, such as your elastic arteries. Those are the biggest ones that are the closest to the heart. And then those lead to smaller muscular arteries. Those branch into smaller arteries that lead finally to your arterioles. Those are the ones that are going to be supplying particular locations in your tissues. Those lead to capillaries. Capillaries in tissues tend to form a network or a bed like you see there. Then those lead to venules. You now have deoxygenated blood because it's in these capillary beds where the oxygen gas is given up to the tissues and the blood picks up the carbon dioxide waste. The venules lead to smaller veins which converge together and or merge together to form the larger veins that eventually bring that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And then if you notice on here, they've the lymphatic, an example of the lymphatic system has been drawn in here, and the lymphatic system helps connect your tissues close to capillaries, but they pick up some fluid from your tissues and carry it through a system of lymphatic vessels back to the bloodstream, and it winds up getting dumped into the large veins up in the upper part of the chest. That's important for helping to control the amount of fluid that you have in your tissues, but we'll study the lymphatic system a whole lot more when we get to the next chapter. Alright, so in the next video lecture we'll talk a little bit more about arteries, and then we'll talk a little bit more about capillaries, and we'll talk a little bit more about veins before we move on to some additional topics for this particular chapter. Probably the most critical topic, the most difficult topic for this chapter will be about blood pressure and how it's regulated. So we're going to finish up this background information on our blood vessels before we move on to that topic.